Good evening, everyone. It is the evening of November 30th, 2020, about 8:30 p.m. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving holiday and that you stayed happy and healthy. It's been a while since we've had a chance to check in, but we're getting down to brass tacks here for the fall 2020 semester. So there's a number of moving pieces. I know you're already aware of them, but just as a reminder, uh, today, this evening, which is November 30th, is the due date for the optional Tohon extra credit assignment. And so you have until midnight tonight to do that. And then this Wednesday, December 2nd, that is when the lab notebook complete scan will be due, and as well as the book report. So please keep those in mind. Those are the last big moving pieces for the class, other than the final exam. Other than that, we have this evening's lecture, which is kind of tying off broad concepts of the course. And then on Wednesday, we will have a final review session. So I thought I'd share really quickly the results from the Google form that I sent out. So you should be seeing this right here. So it looks like 17 people responded, which is just over half of the folks in the class. Right now, showing that 76.5% of the folks are interested in the 8 to 9 p.m. time slot. So that, I'm thinking, is when we're going to go ahead and do the final exam review session. So that would be this Wednesday, December 2nd at 8 o'clock p.m. 8 o'clock, not 8:30. So I'll send an email out about that as well, just to remind you, but then you'll have this as well. And so again, I don't bring any materials for study sessions. It's entirely an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have. So we'll go ahead and plan for December 2nd, which is this Wednesday at 8 o'clock p.m. Using the live Zoom link that is on the lecture module on Canvas. So that is where we will meet. That said, I'm going to go ahead and dive into the last lecture, oh my goodness, of the class. Yeah, there's a fair amount to get through here, even though I think it's enjoyable material. And we'll go from there. So I'd just like to end the class by talking about threats to biodiversity, and then ending on a positive note, why biodiversity matters. Just as a reminder of what we've covered in this class, we've covered a lot, and we've more or less sampled the various tiers of biology. I wouldn't say that we've gone really deep into these various subjects, but we've been very broad in our focus, which is really the broad goal. So we've talked about ecology. We started in Unit 1 way back when, talking about populations and communities and ecosystems. We talked a little bit about the biosphere. And then we came back around, we talked about biochemistry and the different types of biological macromolecules, bonds, organelles, prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells, various cellular processes, osmosis, diffusion. We talked about genetics, so the process by which DNA forms and codes for the synthesis of proteins. And then we've talked a little bit about organismal level processes. We've talked about plants, and we've talked about animals. Just really, really broad. And we haven't gone, again, really deep into these things. We've just sampled these different core areas of biology. And so what I'd like to do this evening is really broadly tie off the course with a bow. to emphasize the interconnectedness between these different concepts and justify why it's important to have a broad understanding of biology, no matter what major you are in or what your broad career goals are. So I think it's a good opportunity to remind yourself, what is the purpose of Biology 11? Why is this class required? And there are a variety of different ways that could be dissected. This question could be looked into, but I'm going to go with some broad uh, uh, hello, Elizabeth. I'm going to go with some broad discussions about why it's important. And so biology or ecology, which is really my sub branch of biology, it's a science. And so not everyone, this is a non-majors biology class, not everyone is a scientist, not everyone is going to be a professional biologist. That is certainly not the expectation. But the kinds of things that we've been talking about through the entire course have a lot of political, economic, and social, even ideological implications. Think back to the ethical concerns that we were discussing back in Unit 3 when we were talking about genetics and cloning and genetically modified organisms and some of the kind of weird ethical concerns that are talked about in that sense. They're controversial, they're nowhere near being solved, really not something that's within the realm of science to answer what we should do about these things, but the science of biology has implications for other areas of society. It's complicated, and people have different views on the matter. I certainly have views, and you'll probably hear some of them tonight. And this is not an attempt to make you believe what I believe. So don't take what I'm saying as gospel truth. It's just it's a complicated thing, and the more informed you are on the facts, the better the basis you are to make informed decisions instead of being merely ideological. Not that you're ideological, but let's face it, a lot of folks in our world are ideological. They just believe what they want to believe. And so, certainly that's true of all of us at one point or another, but the goal here is to be well informed. That's the broad purpose of this class. And biology has a lot of implications that are important to be a well-informed human being. Here's an oversimplification. If you talk about really broadly the study of biology and kind of its overarching pragmatic implications on society in the lens of conservation, here's the problem as I see it, which is really oversimplified. If you want to think of it from, the conservation tree hugger type people, maybe if you've read, why am I forgetting his name right now? What's the guy's name? Gosh, I read these books all the time. I want to say C.S. Lewis, but that's not it. Anyway, this author, it'll come to me. Golly. Anyway, maybe you've read The Lorax, which is a famous children's book. A movie came out about it a few years ago. But the Lorax is basically this furry fella with a big mustache who speaks for the trees. And he insists that that people who want to harvest the trees, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't cut down any trees. You shouldn't use natural resources for any reason whatsoever. It's fundamentally bad. And then on the other side of the continuum, you get people, I call them the suits, who say, oh, we're going to do whatever we want. And, if you get in our way, we're going to sue you or destroy you, do whatever we have to do. That's an oversimplification of the problem. If you want to think of it as like left versus right, way oversimplified, in my personal opinion. There is a lot of intricacy, a lot of nuance to this conversation. And so what I'm going to try to do is introduce some of the nuance Certainly, I'm not gonna lie. I probably lean more toward the Lorax on this side of the equation as opposed to the suit side of the equation. I'm not gonna lie about that. But I'm certainly not 100% in that direction either. So let's just kind of explore some of these things. And again, this is not an attempt to convince you about where I stand, merely try to get your brain juices thinking about some of these questions and problems that our society faces. So let's look at the anthropogenic side of things. Anthropogenic, of course, meaning people, or more specifically, things that have people origins. So about 13,000 years, human society has been widespread since our species first came on the scene in a really big way, Homo sapiens. So that's really before recorded history, 13,000 years. That stretches back a pretty long time, back to the tail end of the last ice age. But we have about 2,000 to 5,000 years, depending on the historian you ask, of measurable human impact. This is written records, as well as from a archaeological perspective, people, modern day archaeologists being able to look back at and look, okay, people, historical person X chopped down this tree 5,000 years ago in this spot. We have about 5,000 years of our species having a measurable impact on the environment. And for the vast majority of this 13,000 years, the environment, the natural world, whatever you want to call it, has generally been seen within the psyche of the human mind, the human imagination, as something to overcome, something that is a challenge, something that threatens your survival. So it's this idea that's very much embedded into the human psyche as nature is a harsh, unlimited concept. So if you think about looking, here's a person here looking out on this vast wilderness expanse. If you were standing in the same person that this person was standing and looking out at this, and you had nothing but your own wits and your own hands to survive looking at this, would you look at this as kind of threatening? From a modern day lens, maybe you look at this as beautiful, and it is beautiful. But if you were a prehistoric person who didn't have any kind of modern civilization to rely on, you might see this as a place full of danger. You might see the river as a place where you could slip and break your leg and drown. You might see the trees as filled with predators. You might see the rocks as something you could get hurt on. You might see the mist as a sign of cold weather that could bring you, prevent you from lighting a fire and kill you that very night. So the idea of nature as a harsh, unlimited concept is something that has been around for a long time and is very much embedded into the human psyche. And so that's, again, has been around in the human imagination for the most part since our inception as a species. That nature is something that has to be overcome. It's a limitless thing that we have to defend ourselves against. And if you break it down even further in the context of human history, this is a vast oversimplification, but there's 3 eras of human history. First being the foraging era, and this is really getting back to more than 13,000 years. But this is kind of, for lack of a better term, the era when human beings were hunter-gatherers, where we would hunt large megafaunal species, large animals. Think of like a woolly mammoth, and then we would also gather fruits and vegetables and other things that we would use to survive. And we basically followed the herds and followed the plants. That's how our species survived. About 8,000 years ago, or 7,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, however you want to break it up, we transitioned into a new era, the agrarian era, where people domesticated themselves and domesticated animals and plants and began to grow things, and that developed cities and governments and empires, which allowed for the diversification of different skills like writing and war and good things and bad things, certainly. I won't go into any more detail because you know what I'm talking about. And then the modern era, which really broadly is only about the last 300 years, where we have a single global system for trade, for how we do things, which has increased the value, not the value, the quality of a lot of people's lives. Certainly not everyone's lives, but a lot of people's lives. But also coinciding with increased rates of extinction. So again, good and bad. So I'm going to try to emphasize both as we go on. This kind of brings, maybe you've heard this term before. Some philosophers are starting to use this term of liquid modernity, which is this idea that human civilization has undergone, especially in the last 75 years, far more rapid change than in the previous 13,000. I mean, even within my lifetime, golly, I was born in the early 1990s. We didn't have internet as a kid. We had a dial-up telephone. My grandmother was born on a dirt farm. She didn't even have running water or electricity. And she would have been 100 this year. She passed away in 2018. In the last 100 years, or 75 years, there's been so much change. I just think about my grandmother. She, again, didn't grow up with electricity, didn't have running water. She grew up dirt poor on a farm during the Depression. And she, by the time she passed away, she had electricity, she had internet, she had heating, she didn't see an automobile for the first time until she was in college. She didn't see an airplane until she was in her 30s. She was well into her 80s when the internet was invented. There's been so much change even within living memory. And so that's what philosophers are starting to call this term liquid modernity. Things are changing so fast we can't keep track of how fast things are changing. Certainly that has good implications, but it also has bad implications. And so I like this artist's rendition of maybe you felt like this at times. You just get so overwhelmed by the vast majority of the complex world that we live in, the cities with all of its technology and lack of nature and all the pressures that our society places upon us, all the systemic issues that our society places upon us, all the injustices. Maybe you just get tired of it sometimes, like me, and feel like you could get away from it all for a while and just sit out and be by yourself. I certainly feel like that at times, and it's one of the reasons why I got into conservation in the first place, was out of a deep desire to sort of get away from it all. Anyway, so that enters our current time, our current epoch, which is called the Anthropocene, the time of the human. It's this time that we're living in where our capacity to manipulate the environment, getting back to the liquid modernity concept, our capacity to manipulate the environment has outpaced nature's ability to catch up. There's been so much change in the last 100 years approximately. And the implications are both good and bad. And this is where the oversimplification of the problem comes in. Depending on who you ask, some people will say, well, the changes that our society has undergone in the last 100 years have only been good. Only good things have come about in the last 100 years. Some people have that belief, whereas other people have the belief that the changes that our society has undergone in the last 100 years have only been bad, 100% bad, which again is an oversimplification. I tend to believe that there's been good things and bad things. But again, this is we're firmly in the arena of opinion at this point. So again, this is not an attempt to convince you about exactly where the line in the sand is drawn. But hopefully you'll agree that there are positive and negative implications of the Anthropocene. So the positive implications that here's a word chart of the modern era, vast diversification of careers and skills and services and work and talent and technology. There's a lot of different things that we can discuss in the context of the Anthropocene and the positive implications it provides. Just to name a few, modern medicine is the most intuitive one. The first antibiotic was only discovered in 1928. So within living memory, Alexander Fleming, a fellow Scotsman, developed penicillin, which, untold millions or billions of people lives have been saved thanks to this drug. It's been able to fight off serious diseases and infections. And now we have even things like vaccines and gene therapy. And 200 years ago, people would die from things like the common cold or the flu, very commonly. And the average life expectancy wasn't all that long ago, all that long ago in the Middle Ages, the life expectancy was like 30, 40, 50 years old. People would die because they would get ill, they would get food poisoning, and there was just no effective way for medicine of that era to treat their condition. Modern medicine has revolutionized all of that. I'm certainly glad to be living in the modern time where if I step on a nail in the garage, I'm not going to get a staph infection and die. I can go get a staph shot, and I'll be okay. Whereas if you stepped on a nail 200 years ago, there was a decent possibility that you could get an infection and die. Or at the very least, maybe have to amputate the limb. Which is awful to think about, but it happened. It was pretty common, really. So modern medicine, I'm glad that we have modern medicine. There's talk even now about a vaccine for the coronavirus pandemic. So hopefully that gets rolled out soon, depending on what your beliefs are. I tend to think that vaccines are a good thing, that there's relatively little evidence that vaccines do bad things to the human physiology. Anyway, modern medicine. Modern agriculture, up until the early 1900s, vast majority of folks throughout the world that basically lived an agrarian lifestyle, had to work really hard with their hands to eke out a really hard living from the land, using trowels and livestock to till the land. It was really hard. Think about the old, Ronald McDonald days of farming. It's very hard to farm the land using your own sweat and blood, and it took the vast majority of our species full-time work, very hard, backbreaking work to produce enough food to feed the world's population. Most of back 100 years ago, 90% of the people in the world were agricultural. They were farmers in one way or another, or tied to the food farming industry. It wasn't uncommon for food shortages to happen, but in the last 100 years, industrial farming techniques and technologies have rapidly increased the rate of food production by multiple orders of magnitude, such that today less than 5% of the world's population works in the agrarian industry. Less than 5%. That's a transition from 90% 100 years ago to 5% today. I mean, it's just a massive decrease in the amount of people that are required to produce our food, and with that decrease in population dedicated to farming, a massive increase in the amount of food that we're able to produce. So it's a kind of a coinciding. It's like a complete split of the trend. Modern technology is yet another thing. I mean, technology has progressed way more rapidly. I mean, from the advent of the light bulb in the late 1800s to the advent of computing technology in the early 1900s. I mean, just look at this really quick chart at the advents of computer technology. My dad, when he was going to medical school in the 1970s, used a typewriter, something like this, to take notes on. And he still has it. He actually still prefers it. Whereas today, I recognize things like this being a product of the 90s. I had one of these old tube TV computer monitors. But maybe some of you, maybe if you grew up in the early 2000s, maybe this is reminiscent of your childhood, or maybe even this. In the early 1900s, this is what a telephone looked like. Now, the iPhone. This iPhone even looks a little bit dated now, doesn't it? I mean, it's just the rapid transformation of technologies like airplanes and radio and the internet has, it's just been so rapid. And so that's massively in, social networking, social media, all these things, 20 years ago, they didn't exist. Massive increase in connectedness and efficiency. I'm of course singing the upsides of these things. I'm not going to go into the downsides here. I will, but not yet. So as a result of all these things, modern medicine, modern farming techniques, modern technology, there's been a massive increase in human population over the last about 100 to 75 years. So you look at this chart from about 1920s. Here's the blue line. Woo! Massive increase. In this time. So just huge increases in the number of people. Again, good or with good implications and bad implications. One example is our home right here in the San Joaquin Valley. This maybe you've seen this before. I think I've shown it. That the growth of green areas basically show the growth of agricultural areas over time, such that today the vast majority of the San Joaquin Valley is in one way or another used for some sort of agricultural purpose. We live in a breadbasket of the world. I mean, especially here in Kern County. I mean, it's like multiple billions of dollars that are of food. A lot of that is cash crop, but a lot of it goes to feeding, producing necessary foods for human consumption. Maybe you are tied to the agricultural working community. I have agricultural roots as well. I know a lot of folks around Bakersfield who work in ag. There's a lot of positive benefits. You work for it, it's your livelihood, it produces food, clearly positive benefits. But negative benefits? Well, we've talked a little bit about how the San Joaquin Valley has had a massively increased, it is one of the best examples of widespread anthropogenic disturbance anywhere in the world. And so, all of the, there used to be, millions definitely millions of elk that would, huge migrations of elk, otter, pronghorn antelope, mountain lions, grizzly bears. I mean, our home in the San Joaquin Valley used to be, a wildlife paradise and a botanical paradise. 200, 300 years ago, but today it's still beautiful and still a paradise in a lot of ways, but certainly not what it looked like 300 years ago. So positive implications, I think certainly, yeah, we can talk about the positive implications of this change, but negative implications, I would probably say that there's both positive and negative implications of this change, just for the specific example closer to our home. So biodiversity loss, getting back to the core focus of what we want to talk about. Biodiversity loss is a key negative implication of the Anthropocene, but you might ask, but wait, depending on who you ask, and maybe I'm already kind of, getting under your skin a little bit. You might ask, but hasn't species diversity changed throughout time? Hasn't it always fluctuated? And the answer would be, yeah. Case in point, the vast majority of all the species that have ever lived on our planet, 99.9% of all the species that have ever lived are now extinct. Species have life expectancies. I'm not talking about individual organisms, but actual species have life expectancies, about on average 1 to 5 million years. That species tend to live on the earth, and then they tend to disappear off the scene. So, species, there are very few species that have been around for millions and millions of years. There are some, like the horseshoe crab, but for the most part, the vast majority of all species that have ever lived are now gone. Okay, the dinosaurs, that comes to mind. Even more recently, things like saber-toothed tigers and giant, huge bears that are now extinct, that were more than twice as big as even the biggest grizzly bear of today. Woolly mammoths, even other species of human being like the Neanderthal are now extinct. And this is broadly broken up into 5 mass extinction events. It's thought that there have been 5 mass extinction events in the last 500 million years, mostly as a result of cataclysmic level events, huge events tied to volcanism, like huge volcanoes exploding or erupting, meteor strikes, and so forth. So here are these 5 past mass extinction events that have contributed to the vast majority of species extinction over time. Like in the Ordovician, for example, 445 million years ago, it's thought that there was a very rapid global cooling, basically a global ice age that destroyed coastal habitats and altered biogeochemical processes and killed off a lot of the species that were adapted to the relatively hot and moist conditions beforehand. Whereas, going through time, different asteroid impacts, increases in methane in the atmosphere, volcanic activity, the event that killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, likely an asteroid impact that was, this asteroid, I actually saw something on the news that compared the size of the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs to like downtown Los Angeles, and like downtown Los Angeles was like a little tiny speck. I mean, even the tallest buildings, New York would have been like a tiny speck. And look at the size of this asteroid. It's just ginormous that killed off. Anyway, the 5 past mass extinction events were largely caused by these cataclysmic level events. The thing about the Anthropocene is, however, that we are now living in a 6th global mass extinction event. Right? So we're going through it right now in the last 300 years, but really especially in the last 50 years. There have been more species have gone extinct in the last approximately 300 to 50 years than in the previous 200,000. So here, if you look at this, this is the cumulative number of extinctions over time. And if you look, starting about the early 1900s, a massive uptick in the number of species that have gone extinct. And this is just what we know about, not what we have not been able to record. And for the most part, these extinctions have been entirely due to human activities in one way or another. And there are a variety of causes for this. And so this current extinction event isn't due to some sort of cataclysmic level event like a volcano erupting or a meteor strike, but to the more subtle things that we human beings are doing that are leading to this. And it's increasing a lot of, decreasing biodiversity by a very significant margin. I might add that the biodiversity that we have today in modern times in the Anthropocene is higher than at any point in the history of life on our world. And so we're losing a lot of that biodiversity pretty quickly. There's a variety of different causes from that. Well, let's just go through some well-known recent extinctions, like the elephant bird that was probably we know was hunted to extinction in about the year 3000 as human beings first began to colonize Madagascar. So the elephant bird, here's a full-sized human being next to an ostrich, which you can still see today. But here's the elephant bird. Ooh, big frickin' bird. Okay, stood well over 2 meters tall. Weighed over a ton. Doesn't it kind of look like a dinosaur in a lot of ways? These were, really very close relative to the dinosaur in a lot of ways. And they were flightless birds. They probably ran pretty fast, but not all that fast. And human beings, when they first began to colonize Madagascar, hunted them off to extinction pretty quickly. The dodo, another example, lived on a small island actually just to the east of Madagascar. Was hunted to extinction in the 1800s in Mauritius, east of Madagascar. Another flightless bird. You can see a pun of this in the movie The Ice Age. A flightless bird, easy to hunt for people. So we killed these off. Pyrenean ibex, which lived in the Pyrenees Mountains, which is by the way the namesake for the Pyrenees Bakery here in Bakersfield. This is a an area where Basque folks, if you know anyone of the Basque community, this is an area where the Basque live. Anyway, the Pyrenees ibex, it was hunted to extinction, I think in the 1700s, mostly for meat. Actually, no, I'm wrong there. It was hunted to extinction more recently, I think in the 1970s. I forget the exact date, but it's no longer around. A thylacine, it's a marsupial native to Australia, so kind of a little bit related to the kangaroo. Interesting mix, kind of looks like a zebra in the back and more like a wolverine in the front. The last individual died in the Bronx Zoo in the early 1900s. We killed them off. They used to be kind of considered pests in Australia, but we kill them off just because people would hunt them. And lastly, the icon of our California flag, the California grizzly, which was an even larger subspecies of grizzly than the grizzlies that you can find up north today in places like Montana and Canada. So it's thought that the very last California grizzly bear was killed off in Big Bear, in San Bernardino, up in the San Bernardino Mountains. You can actually see a taxidermied individual at the post office that is contended to be the last individual that was killed. So it's our flag. Maybe you didn't know this, but it's also extinct. We killed it off due to hunting. So there's a variety of reasons why this sixth mass extinction event is going on, which again is due to human activities. One is direct loss of habitat. And I'm going to go quickly through these slides here since I'm already pushing, I don't want to go too long. I want to keep this under an hour for your sake. Direct loss of habitat, maybe that's a bit intuitive. Less than 1% of the North American Great Plains is left alive. 2% annual forest destruction in the tropic areas. Look at the decrease in green here from original forest cover to basically 2005. Oh, golly. 2% tropical triforest, which is mostly like I think Argentina. Less than 10% of wetlands remain today. About 27,000 species extinction annually due to this. Whereas prior to the Anthropocene, 200 to 300 years ago, about 1 to 2 species were going extinct per century relative to the area under consideration. And so this is, this is kind of demonstrated with this Sentinel Island biogeography. They looked at how as habitat area increases, the number of species increases. This isn't always the case, but generally speaking, species richness is directly related to habitat area. And so as habitat decreases through direct loss of habitat through a variety of reasons, habitat destruction by directly human activities, species richness and diversity decrease. So that's the leading cause of biodiversity loss. Another cause of biodiversity loss, and this is kind of an ancillary effect of habitat destruction, is habitat fragmentation. So even though in a given area we might go through and chomp a huge section of forest through, but we don't chomp all of that. We leave little clumps here, little clumps there. Think about the San Joaquin Desert where we live. I'll show an example of that on the next slide. You leave little clusters of intact habitat left, but these fragmented habitats do not have the same ecosystem function as large expanses of intact habitat. So this is mostly discussed in the context of edge effects, where the edges of fragmented habitat have diminished ecosystem function relative to the quote unquote deep habitat. So if you look at this table right here, certainly the bigger the habitat, the better. So bigger is better than smaller for biodiversity loss, whereas one single clump of habitat is better than in individual clumps that are separated from each other. Whereas if clumps are more closely dispersed versus more widely dispersed, that's better. Versus clumps that have habitat connectivity are better than habitats that do not have habitat connectivity. This is all in the context of edge effects and habitat fragmentation. And here's a more useful example. Right now in the conservation world in the San Joaquin area, it's talked about that uh, the San Joaquin Desert Restoration Plan, which is the idea of trying to piece together remaining intact pieces of native habitat in the San Joaquin area to create habitat connectivity. So something like taking something like this and getting something like this, which increases habitat function. So species that are vulnerable to habitat fragmentation are naturally rare species or species that have wide ranges, species that do not produce a lot of young. All of them are vulnerable in a situation like this, where you get like a species that's trapped in this relatively small fragment, and it does not have access to the surrounding areas. That's a leading cause of biodiversity loss. Another cause of biodiversity loss is the introduction of non-native species, invasive species. Maybe you've heard about things like this before. This is mostly talked about in the context of the enemy release hypothesis, which is this idea that non-native species in a new habitat don't have the same natural regulators that they do in their native habitat. So an invasive species comes into a new habitat, but it's not being predated upon because its natural predators aren't there. It's not being parasitized on because its natural parasites aren't there. It doesn't have the same nutrient restrictions. So it's this idea of kind of the fox in the hen house. You release an invasive species in a novel habitat, and it's going to do way better than it did in its old habitat because it doesn't have the same inhibitors that it did. And so there's a lot of different invasive species. Let's just go through a few examples. Maybe you've heard of tumbleweed before, which is kind of that iconic Old West species. Maybe if you're a fan of old westerns, there's that kind of cliche of the two cowboys facing up each other on that long dusty street on the Old West. They're about to get into some gunslinging action, right? And there's always that tumbleweed that rolls across the dusty town. It's very much emblematic of the old American West. But a lot of people don't know that tumbleweed is invasive. It's very invasive. It doesn't belong here. It was brought in unintentionally, probably in the cattle trade in the 1870s in South Dakota, where it first spread from there. Obviously, it has a really effective mechanism for dispersing its seed. It looks like this when it's actively growing, but when it's an annual, but when the flowers set seed, the annual portions die away, and then it breaks off of the stem, and then it blows in the wind, and it bounces and bounces and bounces, and every time it bounces, it disperses seed. And so it's very, very effective at getting its young to other areas, and it's also very effective at outcompeting native plants, and so it reduces native diversity. Another example is an invasive grass. Maybe you call these foxtails. So think about those things that always get stuck in your socks. Also was brought in by the Spanish in the 1600s as food for cattle. Really hyper competitive. They tend to produce these very thick monocultures where species that are native is a very kind of a textbook example of the enemy release hypothesis, where the foxtail basically completely outcompetes native species through competition as well as inhibition by the thatch it leaves behind. And it also impedes native wildlife species because it forms these thick walls that they can't get through. I'm going through these quick here, but some of these examples will be a little bit more fun than others. Zebra mussels, which cost the world about $6 billion in revenue in loss in fisheries since 1985. This is the result of cargo ships, surprisingly. When cargo ships are in bays. They have these huge tanks inside them called ballasts, and when they're in bays and they need to sit higher in the water, they let all this water out, and it makes the ship go higher. That enables the ship to go into shallower water. But as a cargo ship goes out into the open ocean, it has to withstand high wind and waves, and so the ships fill their ballasts with water, and they suck in a bunch of water, and they usually travel across the globe. And interestingly, as a side, okay, and then when they get to the destination bay, they release all that ballast water. Well, a side effect of this ballast activity is that you suck in a bunch of water from point A, and then you discharge a bunch of water at point B. And so all the critters that were in that water are released on the other side. And this is how zebra mussels have been able to go and spread globally. And they do pretty nasty things. They eat algae and plankton, and they decrease the food supply for adjacent filter feeders and fish species, which is why it's cost the world about $6 billion annually since 1985. I'm going to start going more quickly through these here because I have 15 more minutes before I hit an hour, and I don't want to hit an hour. But cats are an invasive species. I'm sorry if you're a cat lover, but it's true. But cats are highly successful predators. They eat a lot of birds and mammals and lizards. If you have a cat, maybe you maybe your cat has been known to bring some trophies home for you every once in a while. You know what I'm talking about if you have a cat. But if you live on a place like an island like Hawaii or New Zealand, where there's a lot of really rare native bird and mammal and lizard taxa, cats are actually a leading cause of extinction of those areas, especially in islands. And so I'm sorry it's true, but cats are really bad invasive species. And in a lot of areas, they've even gone feral. And lastly, this is an eastern fox squirrel example. So here in Bakersfield, maybe you're used to seeing squirrels that look like this. Have you seen these before? These are not native. The California ground squirrel is what should be here. These were brought to Bakersfield in the 1990s to outcompete ground squirrels at the Stockdale Country Club. And my neighbor was the one who was responsible for doing this. I remember when this happened. The California ground squirrel, which is a ground dwelling species, was causing problems at the golf club because they were digging their burrows in the putting greens, which the golfers didn't like. So they brought in these other species, which is arboreal, tree dwelling, to try to outcompete the ground dwelling squirrels. And it turns out it was wildly successful. They outcompeted the ground squirrels because the eastern fox squirrels are way more successful, but it got way out of hand. And so the eastern fox squirrels are all over Bakersfield now. You've probably seen them, but they do things like eat wires and they live in people's attics, and they're even more of a nuisance than the ground squirrels were. I digress. But anyway, it's so they were thought that they started in the Stockdale Country Club, but they've spread really all throughout Bakersfield since then. Here's a news article about it if you're interested. Okay, overexploitation is another really intuitive cause of biodiversity loss. I won't go into much detail here. Pollution is another one. Again, I won't go into much detail. Soil degradation. I have a lot. There's some things I want to discuss, which is why I'm going through these quickly. So, soil degradation is a huge leading cause of biodiversity loss. And then lastly, I went there. Global climate change. This is unfortunately one of those issues that has become unnecessarily politicized and oversimplified. I'm going to go ahead and say to you that climate change is real, and I hope I don't have to convince you, but I have had to convince people in the past, or try to. climate change is it's the real deal, folks, and it's our fault. And there are some pretty severe implications that are going on as a result of that. Rising sea levels, warming sea levels, ocean acidification, soil salinization, and it doesn't just impact us, or it impact rather native systems. It impacts humans as well. So, there's something that has to be done eventually about it. We can only kick the can along the road for so long. Especially in our very tense political climate these days, this is generally treated as like a left-leaning issue. Eventually, this is not going to be a political issue anymore because we're going to have to deal with it. The issues are going to be so in your face, there's going to be no choice. I hope that time comes soon where the politicism of this issue can be done away with and the science can prevail. But that time doesn't seem to have come yet. Anyway, another leading cause of biodiversity loss. And normally this would be where I would stop. And this would be 2 lectures, but I really want to finish this up. And because this is a bit, maybe you're a little bit depressed at this point. So I want to end the class on a high note and talk about why does biodiversity matter? Why should we be concerned that in the context of the Anthropocene, there's vastly increasing rates of species diversity loss? Why does it matter? Okay, why take this class? Well, here, why does any of this matter for you? Okay, well, for one, ecosystem services, and this is kind of an emerging term that ecologists are starting to use now to draw public attention to why biodiversity matters. Ecosystem services, which are the direct benefits that we get out of healthy, functioning ecosystems. So direct material and economic benefit. So these are things like clean air and water, nutrient cycling, erosion prevention, salt sequestration, crop pollination. These are things that are really hard to put a price tag on because they all occur in the background. They're not directly tied to things that we do, and yet are tied to the good stuff that we're able to get out of nature. And so this is a little bit controversial still, but it's estimated that about $33 trillion worth is attributable to ecosystem services. Some folks disagree on this number. Some folks even disagree on the idea of a number being attributable to at all. $33 trillion is a lot of money. That's 3 times the GDP of the world every year. Ecosystem services is a big one. We wouldn't be able to have clean air and clean water, and we wouldn't be able to have pollinated crops, which enables our food to grow, without healthy functioning ecosystems. Anyway, that's the same slide twice. So broadly speaking, the more diverse a system is, the more resilient it is to dealing with change. One really quick ecosystem service that I'll point to you about is something you may not be aware of, and I think I talked about this really briefly way back in Unit 1. But here it is again. Nitrogen fixation in the soil. Our bodies, from a biochemical perspective, we talked about how nitrogen is a key, it's one of the organic elements, and our bodies, all life depends on nitrogen. And yet most life does not have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it to a biologically usable form. We have to eat other organisms that do have the ability. So here are the responsible organisms right here in these ugly, cancerous-looking things on roots in plants that are largely in the pea family. If you pull up a plant that's in the pea family, you might see these little ugly things on the roots. These are called root nodules. It's actually a mutualism between the pea plant and little microbes that live inside the nodules. The microbes have the biochemical capacity to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and then they give that nitrogen to the plant, and the plant in turn gives the microbes some of the products of photosynthesis, sugars. And so it's a very, very neat little mutualism. And then other organisms come along and eat these plants, and then Organisms eat those organisms, and they work their way through the process of biomagnification, which we talked about as well, to organisms like us. And so it's really due to structures like this that we're able to survive, which is an ecosystem service. Most nitrogen fixation occurs in healthy, intact ecosystems. It's not something that is artificially produced. So healthy, functioning life as a whole depends on situations like this, where plants and are able to grow in relatively undisturbed areas. So thank you, pea plants, and thank you, root nodules. Why does biodiversity matter? This is kind of getting into a personal view, but I still hope that you agree with me, is that life is interconnected. There are many interactions, interspecific interactions, intraspecific interactions, mutualisms, predations, all of these different things, all of the different concepts we've been talking about through this entire class, they do not exist in a vacuum. Everything. Nothing exists on its own. Everything has an impact on something else, which was kind of one of the first people. Robert Payne in intertidal experiment was one of the first people we talked about that looked at this, which was this idea of the keystone species, the interaction between the purple sea urchins and ochraceous sea stars and sea otters and the giant bladder kelp that is the habitat for the vast majority of fish in oceans of the Pacific. It's this web, this food web, that really draws attention to how all of these different components are interconnected. People didn't used to think about it this way, but really it turns out life is interconnected, and we have an influence on other things, and they have an influence on us. So I'll point you back to this specific example of the interconnectedness of life. Another way to think about this is thinking about biodiversity as a tapestry. So here is a beautiful Turkish pillow that takes years and years to make. If you think about biodiversity as this whole tapestry, does one string on its own really matter all that much? Let's say you own this pillow or this tapestry, and I come to your house and I say, I don't like this string in your tapestry. I'm just going to pull it out. And so I pull out that one string, or that one strand, and it basically looks the same now as it did before. Maybe you'll get a bit ticked off at me for having pulled the string out, but ultimately, does that one string really matter all that much to the whole? Well, maybe not. The tapestry's still there. The pillow still works. But what if I do it again? And again, and again, and again, and again? What if I pull 1,000 strings out? Do you think this tapestry will still be as beautiful? I don't think so. Eventually, it'll just fall apart, right? So that's the idea of the interconnectedness of life. It's very hard to articulate exactly how interdependent life is on itself. If you take one species out of the equation, does it have an ultimate impact? Well, it depends on the species. But it's hard to justify. Why should we care that one beetle species in the Amazon rainforest is going extinct? Well, that's because it's hard to measure the impacts in terms of the interconnectedness of life. Another reason is aesthetic value. Why does biodiversity matter? Thank goodness Theodore Roosevelt created the national park system back in the 1900s, or else we wouldn't have any national parks like Yellowstone to be able to enjoy. This would probably have been gone. It would have been turned into a big mining operation. So thank goodness we had people who were pioneers of conservation, who specifically conserved land for not only for ecosystem services, but also for aesthetic value. We have a place to go to. Hopefully you have taken advantage of that in the past, and you've gone to a national park or a state park and you've enjoyed it. So there's certainly aesthetic value, which has many different benefits to it. You can also bring up the moral, ethical reason. What right do we have to do things, to killing off species, of over-exploiting things? What right do we have to pollute? What right do we have to do things that have a negative impact on other species, even if this were to have no impact on us whatsoever? if our actions only impact the other species and had no impact on us, the moral ethical reason still remains. What right do we have to do these things? What right do we have to inflict pain on other forms of life? And lastly, I know not everyone is religious, but a lot of folks are, including myself. So this is not an attempt to proselytize, but pretty much all the major religions in the world, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, other religions, which I'm less familiar with, Hinduism, Buddhism, all the major religions in the world have traditions that teach that nature is sacred, that human beings are stewards of creation. Even secular, if you're an atheistic person, secular humanists aren't that different at all. They all tending to emphasize that human beings are responsible for stewarding life, that it's something that is of greater value than itself. So, from a religious perspective, even though a lot of religious institutions sadly don't teach this anymore, there's a general emphasis that that nature is a gift from God or a gift of creation, depending on what your specific tradition teaches you. And so it should not be taken for granted. And so with that said, I am just up on an hour, to keep it under an hour for your sake. With that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for this evening. Hey, look, folks, I know this has been a challenging semester, being remote in this COVID pandemic. A number of you have even gotten it, and thanks for bearing with me. You stuck through to the end. I'm happy to say, I'm going to brag about you a little bit. Of all the biology 11 classes that are going on this semester, there's 11 sections of biology 11 this semester. This section has had the highest retention out of any of the other 10 throughout the whole semester. I think we started off with 35 people and we're about 27 now. And so, you've stuck with me through thick and thin, and I just want to say thank you. I realize the remote environment is challenging. And I hope I've done a good job in explaining what needs to be done. But this being our last recording, maybe this will be the last time that you have a chance to hear from me before the end of the class, other than on email. I just want to say thank you for a great semester. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me in the future if you need it. I'm happy to write reviews, or not reviews, letters of recommendation. If you ever have a question, please do not hesitate to get in contact with me. And that being said, remember that we have a review session this Wednesday at 8 p.m. I'll send an email about that shortly. And then keep an eye out for emails regarding the final exam itself, which I think is scheduled for December 9th at 5 p.m. But I'm saying that from memory. So let me just go ahead and, in case I said the wrong date, let me go ahead and just double check. The final exam is going to be, yes, on December 9th, Wednesday, December 9th at 5:30 p.m. on Canvas. And so I'll be sending you email messages about that. Anyway, that's enough for this recording, folks. Please do not hesitate to be in contact if you have any questions or concerns. All right, thanks for a great semester. Checking out.